So you need a final look at a terrific piece of descriptive narrative writing that would get the full 40 out of 40. You're in the right place. Let me propel you towards a grade 9. Yes, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
I've written a response for this past question from June 2023. At that moment, she realised. I planned the response carefully to ensure that my piece goes somewhere and has a skillfully controlled overall structure. You can find 4 detailed plans for 4 past paper questions within the video entitled Sample Grade 9 Plans, Paper 2 Section B, OCR GCSE English Language. Press pause now if you'd like to scrutinise the full plan for this model response in more detail. At that moment, she realised that her response had been disproportionate. Hannah, which way, since you ask, was your typical Year 11 teenager? Perhaps. She loved playing football on a Sunday morning and had been a key member of the Littleton Blues team for a number of years. Quiet and understated off the pitch, she would transform into a snarling, combative and highly effective central midfielder on it. Although she wasn't glued to her phone like some others in her year group, it was important to her. She enjoyed the mindless escapism of TikTok videos and football-related banter within various WhatsApp groups. She also liked spending time on her own and gardening. Yes, gardening. After most days at school, she would get changed into some baggy old clothing and head down to the back of Titmarsh Lane, where her father had eventually succumbed to nagging and leased an allotment. After an initial tedious period of clearing and weeding, she had created a vegetable plot with courgettes, French beans, and torpedo-shaped Italian onions. The latter were belatedly beginning to sprout, whilst her parents had been impressed and amused by the size and shapes of the courgettes smugly deposited on the kitchen table back at home. Meanwhile, in the space by the rather dilapidated shed, there was now the most splendid splash and wash of colour, with golden yellow California poppies nestling amongst lilac cornflowers, but lanky sunflowers hovering the highest. You may start writing. Much as she knew she ought to spring into life and write furiously about the language and structure of a dull-sounding narrative, or explore some statement about 2 texts powerfully describing something or other, more often than not she found her gaze switching to the upper branches of a tree outside the sports hall. How long would it be until the tree flowered? She estimated a mere few weeks. No, possibly even sooner than that. Dreamily looking up further, she watched a remarkably symmetrical clump of clouds drifting through the grey-blue sky. The discussion of her mock exam results was unpleasant and awkward. On the one hand, her mother adopted a fast and furious approach, combining high-pitched, loud whines with non-stop sentences aimed to guilt trip. On the other hand, her father looked sadly into the distance and avoided eye contact. But how was any of this fair? Why should 10 2-hour time periods of mindless regurgitation and memory recall be so damned important? Why should such intense meaning be attached to such dull, repetitive actions, so devoid of creativity or practical importance, or indeed life? Emotions began to spin chaotically inside Hannah's head like an old-school washing machine. She felt confused, angry, slash And so Hannah put the garden shears to disturbing the effective use, embarking on a rampage of destruction. Chop! Off came the heads of the lanky sunflowers, reduced to Anne Boleyn's in seconds. Hack! Down came the lilac cornflowers, along with the golden carpet of California poppies. Lop! Time for those pesky Italian onion sprouts to be dismembered. It had become a wasteland. They were waiting for her. Her father spoke first. Your mother and I have been speaking. Yes, we would have preferred you to have achieved better mock examination results. But you know, and we all know, that there is so much more to life than bloody GCSEs. We are so proud of the young person you are, and nothing will change that. The following morning after school, as per her routine, she headed towards Titmarsh Lane and her sanctuary. And her eyes widened as she saw afresh the fruits of the previous day's labour. Shards from ceramic pots, a wave of drooping, headless stalks, an ugly pile of lilac and golden yellow mixed with dirt and stones. At that moment she realised that her response had been disproportionate. Shall we scrutinise this response in detail? How does it achieve 40 out of 40? Well, there's a variation in paragraph lengths, with an opening single sentence paragraph which leaves the reader screaming, well, hang on, what did she do for her to rather worryingly dismiss her response as disproportionate? Note the use of the word disproportionate within the first sentence. Aim to show off your vocabulary. Choose more complex words, provided, of course, they work and are used precisely. Tone is so important in this section. Aim to use a more sophisticated tone, which in this particular instance is more conversational. Here I do this by not just writing Hannah Ridgway, but by writing Hannah brackets Ridgway, comma, since you ask, close brackets. I'm beginning to build up a relationship with my dear reader. Please use apostrophes accurately. I recently offered to pay my Year 10 class £100 per pupil if they didn't make any more apostrophe errors before the end of Year 11. They agreed enthusiastically. However, literally within that first double lesson, a pupil made an apostrophe clangor. He was apologetic and shamefaced, but the bet had already been lost. The AO6 component of the mark scheme looks for an ambitious range of sentence structures shaping meaning and creating impacts. This is achieved here by the variety in initial first words within each sentence. Hannah, perhaps, she, quiet, although, she, and. However, notice the one-word sentence, perhaps. You would expect the adverb perhaps to be embedded within the first sentence. However, this change casts doubt on the typicality of young Hannah in an intriguing way, thus ensuring that the range of sentence structures is ambitious, shapes meaning, and creates impacts. Make sure your paragraphs flow on from each other. The idea of a 16-year-old young person being keen on gardening is so surprising that I emphasise this by repeating it within an enthusiastic exclamation at the start of a different paragraph. Remember also to give small details in these pieces. It isn't just working on the allotment, it is clearing and weeding. It isn't just growing vegetables, it is growing courgettes, French beans, and torpedo-shaped Italian onions. Remember to give locations, the back of Titmarsh Lane. Your vocabulary needs to be precise and subtle, so that you express complex ideas with clarity. Here, Hannah's father eventually succumbed to nagging, whilst the Italian onions were belatedly beginning to sprout. The courgettes have been smugly deposited, whilst the shed is dilapidated. As with the vegetables, don't just talk about flowers generically, but rather California poppies, cornflowers, and sunflowers. Remember, within such a comparatively short piece of writing, you shouldn't include boring, mundane details. You can shift between important moments, as I do here, by moving straight to dialogue signifying something crucial in any Year 11's year exams. Meanwhile, returning to the theme of using an ambitious range of sentence types, within the yellow section I move from a rhetorical question to a simple sentence to a complex sentence. Be wary of dialogue. I would keep it to a minimum, partly because it can be dull, and partly because so many errors are typically made in terms of punctuation. This video is helpful in this regard. Note how much ground I cover within the paragraph coloured yellow, particularly in the sentence summarising her mother's words and attitude. Meanwhile, in the subsequent paragraph, note the phrases 10 2-hour time periods of mindless regurgitation and memory recall, and such dull, repetitive action so devoid of creativity or practical importance. I'm not just saying GCSEs are a waste of time, in it, but something more sophisticated, which even the most passionate supporter of GCSEs would recognise contain a degree of truth. You know about using a few similes in this part of the exam. Here, emotions are beginning to spin chaotically inside Hannah's head like an old-school washing machine. Note the random hyphenated adjective old school, i.e. the ones that move around more as the cycle really gets into a swing. A weaker candidate might have written this. But the one-word, single-sentence angry helps set the scene and foreshadows the horrendous destruction in the allotment which follows in the subsequent paragraph. Again, it's worth considering the tone in this particular paragraph. Does the onomatopoeia give the impression of a jaunty tone which partially masks the hurt and anger causing all of this destruction? Meanwhile, consider the metaphor about the sunflowers. It's different. It's striking. It's not cliched. If you recall, Anne Boleyn was one of Henry VIII's wives who got beheaded. There's another metaphor in the subsequent sentence, this time about the California poppies, which emphasises the scale of the destruction. Whilst I do recommend keeping dialogue to a minimum, used sparingly, it can be very effective and provide variety, a different perspective. Here I bring in the father, who crucially said nothing earlier on in the story, but instead looked sadly into the distance and avoided eye contact. The mark scheme states that accurate punctuation is used to enhance clarity and achieve particular effects. I interpret this as meaning that you use not just blooming commas and full stops and exclamation marks accurately, but colons and semicolons too, as I do here. The colon introduces the longer list of items separated by semicolons. This is another good video to watch if you're very slightly hazy about how to use colons. Finally, the final sentence repeats the very first one with its use of a circular structure. However, notably, the opening statement has now been explained. We know what the response was, which ultimately has now been recognised as disproportionate.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, helping you with Paper 2, Section B, with the exam just days away. Good luck and many thanks for watching.